All right. I am really excited today to have a special guest. His name is Kevin Kookogey. A very hard name to spell or pronounce.
But you got it right. You got it right.
Yeah, and it's a name that you'll never forget once you get it right and hear it. So, this is the Christian Music Industry Podcast. If you're listening for the first time, thanks for joining us. And we really just try to dive into the music industry, especially the Christian music industry, to help people just gain insights and have a better understanding of how things operate, and also just be inspired to continue to do what God's called them to do. So, Kevin, I am excited to have you on here because you are our first attorney on the podcast.
It's kind of
And
amazing. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Hopefully, it's good.
yeah. Yeah, and I have really enjoyed like interacting with you and learning from you and just hearing your story. And I thought it would be really cool to have you on and share your insights because one thing I learned about you is that you've been doing this a long time. So-
Amen. Hard to believe. 32 years already.
wow. Yeah, that's a pretty long time. That's probably more than a lot of people that are listening have been alive. So-
Wow. Okay, so your audience caters young. Then I'm not talking to the old folks.
yeah, we're hoping to encourage and like really empower the younger artist demographic, but also we have a lot of older 30s to 40s listeners. So just to give you a little bit of a background on Kevin, he is an entertainment lawyer and music business executive with 32 years of experience. Over more than 3 decades, he has represented hundreds of recording artists, publishers, songwriters, producers, churches, festivals, merchandisers, touring companies, and independent labels. And he co-founded Teleprompt LLC, a marketing and management company organized to support the career of Mute Math, an act Kevin was privileged to manage for 14 years. And Kevin has written a number of books, is a public speaker, co-hosts a weekly podcast, which I actually did not know until I read your bio.
There you go. Always something
Uh, and you lead a weekly Bible study. He also teaches lectures on Christian apologetics and the political duty of the people of God. So, welcome, Kevin.
new. Yeah,
And
thanks, Wisdom. So, out
yeah,
of all that, what do you want to talk about first?
I'm curious, whatever you're able to share, who have you worked with as far as, companies or artists in the Christian music industry, or do you currently work with?
Yeah, so I think it's probably helpful if I give my journey because it will tell you when some of these clients
Yeah.
came into the process. And in a formal sense, people we try to kind of keep the client list um, confidential. But this is a narrative. This is a place that we want people to understand. There's legitimacy in what we're saying. We're not
Mm,
just making up things theoretically. So, but I Wisdom actually. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, although I've been here in Nashville for 32 years. And my journey to Nashville began when I sent out a resume. I sent out a bunch of resumes, just cold resumes,
mm,
to a bunch of music industry people in Nashville in the spring of 1992, as I was finishing law school at Temple University in Philadelphia. And I was recently married. My wife was at the time a nurse anesthetist, and she was going to be moving to Tennessee with me
mm,
as soon as I finished law school. I went to law school with a bunch of people who are now great litigators and people who do commercial real estate transactions, who work for judges. And I had a totally different track because my undergraduate degree was in music,
mm,
Berklee College of Music in Boston, and then went back to Temple, where I'd done a few years of undergrad to finish law school. So from I literally I was telling somebody this last night actually finished the bar exam the 2nd or 3rd of August 1992. No, sorry. That's when we moved. I finished the bar exam the 30th or 31st of July. And then a couple of days later we hopped in our U-Haul and came to Tennessee.
wow.
And that was the beginning of the journey. And it was kind of I came down here because I only got one response from a good friend of mine, a guy by the name of Ken Johnson, who at the time was a young employee in A&R at Word Records,
Mm.
and he was the only person that responded to my mass resume sending out to the Christian music industry. Ken said I should call a lawyer whose name I won't mention for his protection, but another lawyer. He said, you should call him. He represents a lot of people at the time, 30
Mm.
years ago, who were big in the Christian music industry. And so I did. I contacted this particular attorney, and he didn't have any work for me. He ran a small firm, but he actually interviewed me 3 times from August until November of 1992. And what made that, I never knew quite where I stood. I'm like, am I going to get a job, or are we just having a conversation? Well, so think about this. When a lawyer gets out of law school, he doesn't know anything about practicing law. He just has a law degree,
Mm.
has taken the bar exam. And because I was so new to the town, nobody knew who I was. I didn't have any kind of connections down here, didn't have a job. Meanwhile, my wife was a nurse anesthetist, and so she was in the company of a lot of very wealthy doctors, and they
Mm.
would invite us to their parties at these giant mansions in Belmead and places like that. And here I am, this unemployed lawyer wanting to break into the music industry, and I felt like I was about this big. I felt insignificant, unimportant. Despite the encouragement from these doctors, I would say, I'm unemployed. I'm trying to break into the music industry as a lawyer. It was so stressful, Wisdom, that I actually got shingles in that
Oh, wow.
process. And so the level of stress of being unemployed, trying to follow your dream, was physically
Wow.
encumbering at the time. But by God's grace, I was finally hired by this attorney,
Mm.
and in that early process, so there's a couple of important things to point out here. That attorney, so when you don't practice law in another state, you can't get reciprocity. So even though I passed the bar in Pennsylvania, I'd never practiced law in Pennsylvania.
Uh,
So I still had to gear up to take the Tennessee bar exam as
oh, wow.
well, which I, by God's grace, also passed. But in that time frame, I had worked for a couple of months for this other attorney. I went and took the bar exam in Tennessee. So it took a couple of weeks off to cram and get ready for that. And when I called back the lawyer's office that I was working for, I got a pre-recorded message that said, if you know the whereabouts of this attorney, which was my boss at the time, please call this person. If you have any files, please contact the FBI.
Oh.
And I was floored. I'm like, what is going on? 3 hours later, I turn on the television, and it's all over Nashville media that this
Oh,
particular lawyer he was under indictment from the FBI. Had I think the charges were bank fraud. If you can find it by looking it up. Um,
wow.
92, and so it was devastating to me because my dream job of working for a sole practicing attorney in the Christian music business was immediately taken out from under me, and I thought
Right.
that, what in the world am I doing? Moreover, I was worried about affiliation because I had met him and I
Yeah.
didn't know anything about his crimes. Well, that was a big blessing by God in the timing of this, because all of his crimes had been committed prior to my meeting him,
Mm.
and I didn't know anything about it. And when I called, so his clients dispersed to other lawyers in town and things of that nature. And I tried to call some of those other lawyers to get work. They didn't know who I was. Now, to me, that was very frustrating. I'm like, okay, you don't know who I am, but do you not
Mm.
need my help? They're like, no, we didn't get all of this other attorney's work. We got some of
Mm.
it. And we don't know who you are. You're some kid from Pennsylvania, just graduated from law school, right? So I didn't realize, Wisdom, how much of a blessing that was from God, though, because he protected me. He brought me to town in a time when I could just get my toes dipped in the water, but prevented me from getting here early enough that I could be affiliated with what
Mm.
this other attorney had done. And
Yeah.
in that time frame, those couple of months that I worked for this other attorney, is when I met the Newsboys. And the
Mm.
Newsboys have been, for 32 years, have been my most loyal client, and have really been a client that's led to so many other clients and opportunities. It's been a great relationship of trust and growth. And at that time, the newsboys were just getting to the point of needing and being able to afford regular counsel, and they were beginning to expand the career and finally have a little success on radio.
Mm,
And that became such a foundational moment. So what I felt was a devastating entry into Nashville was actually God's biggest blessing, and it allowed me to do what I've always, I think God has created me to do, which is I've always worked for myself, always been self-employed. It's something my father did when I grew up in Pennsylvania. He was a self-employed attorney, and although he didn't do any of the type of work that I do, I think I learned wisdom both. What do you call it? Nature or nurture? I
mm,
think both nature and nurture. I learned how to run a small office practice, which comes down primarily to communication with your clients, treating them with respect, created in the image of God. And it may sound like it's not rocket science, but you would be amazed at how many lawyers, especially ones who have worked for big firms, do not understand the importance of simple communication with clients. In
yeah.
fact, I would say this: there are many lawyers who are more skilled simply in the skill of law and
Mm,
the practice of not the practice of law, but the technicalities of the law than I am.
mm,
There's nothing that separates me from others that way. But if there's any advantage that God has given me, I learned very early how to treat clients and how to work the relationships to make sure that the clients are respected, even if you're not able to get something done, if you're not able to finish it within their time frame, always communicating, saying, I haven't forgotten about you. I've had to bump it to next week. You'd
mm,
be amazed at how much that earns the trust and respect of your clients. So
yeah.
all praise and glory to God. But that's why I'm here, and that's how
Wow.
I've been able to immerse myself. And by God's grace, 32 years of providing for my family, doing what I love to do.
Wow. What an incredible story of your journey. Because a lot of times we see people at their prime of like doing what they do, and we don't know the backstory of how they got there. So
Yep.
yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I will echo what you said. Like something that really stands out about you, from my experience working with you, is your communication. And I've worked with a lot of different attorneys, and sometimes, some attorneys will make you feel dumb for asking
Yeah.
questions, and
I've had
uh,
that too. I've had other lawyers make me feel dumb.
yeah. Yeah, and sometimes, like, you just don't hear back from an attorney for weeks, and that's something I really appreciate about you, is just, the promptness and the clear communication, because that's super helpful, because, I don't know that any of us really, like, see the legal side as, like, fun, you know?
Yeah.
It can feel overwhelming and just, it could feel very confusing at times. So like somebody like you who clearly communicates in a way that somebody could understand, and you're able to explain contracts in layman's terms, and also just like give a timeline of like, this is when you can expect to hear back from me on this. That's really something I've appreciated about you. And one thing that I want to ask you about is, because when somebody's like starting in this as an artist, or even like starting a label, there's definitely things I've seen that people just don't know. They don't know.
Yep.
Like they don't know what they're supposed to be like setting in place. Uh, so I would love to hear from you as far as like when you're starting as an artist and maybe you're not signed, like what are things that you've seen that people forget or don't know that they need to be putting in place pretty much right away?
Well, let's first discuss the change that has happened, because my answer to that
Mm,
question 30 years ago would be much different than it is today,
yeah.
for two reasons. The first reason is because my experience, I was at the beginning of my experience, so I would have given a different answer
Mm,
that was based more on what I had learned from people who had gone before me. So it wasn't really my experience. I was
mm,
vicariously explaining to them what I think would happen because of what I've seen happen or read had happened or other lawyers had told me.
yeah.
But the other aspect is our industry, as you know, has changed so much where
Mm,
it's no longer record company necessary or record company centric. Again, 3 decades ago, in fact, when I moved to town, the internet, funny, it was brand new. The AOL dial-up connection, you know, that funny little sound that was the internet. And all the lawyers were talking about at my seminars in those days was their fear of losing record sales to what was permanent downloads. That was the big fear, which is kind of ironic because permanent downloads are almost nothing today, right? Streaming is so dominant. And then physical product, if you're talking about it, vinyl has its own kind of a special market for vinyl. But permanent downloads, they live such a short shelf life. And it's kind of funny that looking into the future, people thought those were going to be a problem. Nevertheless, certainly technology transformed the music industry. And once the music industry stopped going after old ladies and college students, you know, remember back in Napster days, they wanted to sue grandparents and sue college kids. They tried to sue their way into retaining controls of the way the industry used to be. But technology, as it always does, had advanced. So there was no point or purpose in doing that. Once the music industry figured that out, then they realized, okay, now we need to monetize this new technology. And having said that, so that establishes the framework for this part of this discussion. First of all, I love new clients, especially ones that have not been in the industry before. They're offered a record contract, or maybe they're offered a management agreement because what they're doing is not yet ready for a label, but their development is clearly on the rise. This industry has always been based on the song. It doesn't matter what the technology is. It doesn't matter what your name is. It doesn't matter how flashy you are and all the imaging. That is still secondary, tertiary, or further down the stream from the song. Because if you don't have the song to connect, it doesn't matter. The entire industry, as you know, revolves around the song. But if you do have the song, then the whole career, you've got the foundation for a career. And in the old days, the record company was the hub of the wheel. And if you had a record contract, then you would go get your publishing agreement. In the Christian music industry, those were typically offered by the same companies because it's a much smaller universe than in the general market, where you would sign with a record label. And it's frowned upon in the general market to have the same record company that signs you also own your publishing. There's always two competitors for that. But unique to our industry has always been the Christian music industry is a microcosm of what goes on in the general market. We have every style of music in our market, distinguished only by the lyrics, right? Historically. So we reach a much smaller base. Our shows, we cannot perform to the millions of people. We're performing to hundreds of thousands of people. We're performing to a fraction of all people groups that they do outside of the Christian market. So because of that, the costs are the same, right? It costs the same to rent a bus. It costs the same to rent production. It costs the same to produce merchandise, but our revenues are far less than they are in the general market. So the way that historically the Christian music has operated is you have companies capturing more of those rights to justify the expenditures. So one thing that has not changed, old technology, new technology, is when an artist comes to your office and you're engaging with them, if the attorney is not skilled in the Christian music space, the attorney is likely to compare it to the general market and say, well, these deals are totally unfair, that, you know, the margins are too thin. You should be getting much more. Your advances should be bigger. Your royalty should be higher. I've never had that challenge. When an artist comes to me and gets offered Christian music industry terms, my first introduction to the client is to say, you cannot compare this. It's apples and oranges if you compare this to the general market. Yes, if you were getting a general market contract, we could ask for these things, but there's no use asking for them in the Christian market because the margins aren't there. They're not trying to rip you off. They just don't have the margins. And I know that because for many years I represented independent record companies. I was the first lawyer for Tooth and Nail Records. I represented Spirit Lag Records, represented Impop Records, Flicker Records. I mean, go on and on with all of these independent labels. Cut my teeth. Heck, before Tooth and Nail, I represented REX Music. If any of your audience goes back and researches that, old bands like Code of Ethics was a band in the 90s that was on REX. And REX was kind of the forerunner. In fact, Brandon Ebel, who founded Tooth and Nail Records, The only reason he wanted me to be his lawyer was because he wanted to have the lawyer that represented REX,
Mm,
which I always thought was funny because Brandon had such huge success and REX ended up going out of business a couple years later.
mm,
Again, by God's grace and timing, I represented REX, which led to my opportunity and privilege to represent Tooth and Nail.
mm,
So anyway, it's kind of got off track there. So as to a new artist, the understanding that the Christian music is different and having the confidence to not say to the artist or to not puff up the artist, I think unfairly. Sometimes attorneys will come in to what I would consider our industry, the Christian music industry, and ask for things that because they're not possible to give, they will sometimes turn the artist against the label who wants to help them succeed based on really a straw man. And that
mm.
straw man is, what could you get outside the Christian music industry? My response is, are you getting an offer outside the Christian music industry? If you are, great. Let's go pursue that. But
Yeah.
if this is all you have, let's be honest within that framework. So
Mm,
on that point, Wisdom, I think it's really important to be honest with your clients and say, when we're negotiating, we have to negotiate within what is reasonable and possible in this industry.
mm,
Um, but then from there, because technology today has made the record company not the most important part of the process, the record companies have also changed how they view an artist. In
mm.
the old days, the record companies would take an artist and begin to develop that artist and work with them and spend time developing songs and records and eventually get to the point of release. Well, as you know now, record companies don't even want to invest anything in an artist until the artist has something going on.
Yeah.
That's something going on is, what is your social media presence? What kind of subscribers and plays do you have on YouTube? And are you doing, they've always been interested in, are you doing live performances?
Mm,
But when those things are happening, my advice to a new artist is typically you probably don't need to do this deal yet. You might have an offer now, but you're doing really well and you seem to be very well organized over here. Why do you want to consider the label deal?
mm.
And it usually comes down to this. An artist today is at the point where they're like, I don't want to do the administration of my career. I don't want to do the back office stuff. I don't want to do um, the handling of royalty payments to the people that I've co-written with. So I need a publishing administrator. I want someone to do all that non-creative work for me so that I can just focus on being creative and then building a business, which is the last part to it. When you succeed in any business, then you have to start building the right structure, entity structure, your employment relationships, insurance, and kind of mapping out a career strategy, which is in one way it's unique to the music industry because of our topic and our substance, but in another way it's like any other small business. You still have to comply with state law when you're setting up entities. You still
Mm.
have to file your taxes, federal and state, at the same way you would regardless of the business. You get into estate planning, and although I don't do estate planning, I have other attorneys that I deal with who do estate planning. So then there becomes a kind of business model and a sequence through which you go based on, when I look back at my career, I can tell, okay, this artist is ready for this service now.
Mm.
They're at the point where they can justify spending to build this protection for them to provide for their families. You get into sale of catalogs after an artist has built a catalog over 5 to 10 years. Then they've built up a nice catalog that they can sell. And today we have a market of investment bankers that didn't exist 30 years ago. They looked at the music industry and said, why in the world would we buy a music catalog? It's volatile, right? There's no stability in it. But once streaming came out, the beautiful thing about streaming is that people are always paying. You and I, when we pay our Spotify, Apple subscriptions, we're really paying every time we use music. Whereas in the old days, you buy an album unless it's broken or unless you wanted a backup copy, or cassettes had been worn out and you needed something new. You buy the album once and you never buy it again.
Yeah.
So even though you're paying $20 for a CD, you're buying it once.
Mm,
Today, yes, we're paying pennies and fractions of pennies for the music we listen to, but we're paying for it every time. And that's what changed the
mhm.
investment. The investment banks became very interested in music catalogs because there was always new money. It didn't matter that this album was 20 years old, 30 years old, if somebody's listening to it today, they're paying for it again and
Yeah.
again, again.
Mm.
So that's an exciting part of the of how technology has really benefited the music industry. My only not my regret, I think the music industry should regret the fact that they hung on to the old model instead of finding a way to monetize it sooner. And they wasted a lot of time worrying about what they were losing rather than seeing
Mhm.
we can gain more.
Yeah.
So I kind of went a lot of places with that, but as you can see, I get excited talking about where things go.
Yeah. One thing that, a lot of artists and even, churches that I talk to um, don't really know a whole lot about is these different organizations that they need to register with.
Yes.
So they all know, like, I need a distributor, I need a place to upload my music so it gets sent to Spotify and all the places.
Yep.
And then most people know about the PROs, BMI, ASCAP, so they register with one of those.
Yep.
And then a lot of them, I would say more than half of the people I talk to don't know about the other organizations like the MLC, Sound Exchange. So could you share a little bit about, the organizations that they need to be aware of and register with?
Yes. And CCLI
Yeah.
is so important. Yeah. As you were mentioning that, that's you did a really good job of giving a synopsis of how our industry has changed with technology. Instead of a record label, at least until you get to the point where a record label justifies spending the money, most new artists and most artists know this now. I talk to my children who are now adults and to friends of children, and they talk about technology way beyond where I am. They're like, "Oh yes, we already know that, Mr. Kookogey. We already know that," and they help me figure those things out. So checking in with young people is always very helpful. But DistroKid, TuneCore, right? Companies like that, there's two most popular, become a one-stop for you to be able to upload your music. And what's great about that is you put all your data in there, and as long as you put your data in there correctly, then everybody's getting paid as they are to get paid. And that basically takes the place of a customary traditional distributor of records in the physical sense. We used to send records out. And then, as you mentioned, the performing rights organizations, the terrestrial traditional performing rights organizations, ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC, they're still necessary. They collect, obviously, from terrestrial radio performances. They still collect for live performances, and that has modified over the years. It used to be when you would play a live show and play your own material, you wouldn't get credit for playing your own material. You had Christians playing only their songs at an event, and the money that was going from their fee that they had to pay it to the promoter as part of the expenses, that would go to pay, Garth Brooks or, some other top performer at the time, whoever was at the top of the charts in those days. They've reconciled and corrected that, so now artists do get an allocation of the money that they play, but you have to submit your titles that you're playing at those events, and you can get paid. But most of that today, because there's a much smaller market of traditional terrestrial radio, that it's a shrinking market, but it's been replaced in the digital space by a number of other collection agencies. And the what what a lot of people don't, I think probably the biggest misunderstanding in our industry, most people don't understand what Sound Exchange is.
Mhm.
And even Sound Exchange has gotten smaller as to its share of income. But Sound Exchange came about because of the change in technology. ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC did not have it in their original agreements to collect for digital revenue. It was only for terrestrial radio and television and things of that nature, movies. But the movies that are on TV, not movies in theaters, which are paid differently.
Mm.
But Sound Exchange, when Sound Exchange came about, it went to capture a void, which was twofold. It was digital transmission of music, so digital radio like
Mm.
Sirius, and in the old days, Pandora was paid directly through Sound Exchange. Now Pandora goes through the record labels. But the other difference principally was now you had a place where the creators of the audio recording could benefit from the performance of their songs, which
Mm.
never happened and still doesn't happen under ASCAP, BMI, or CSAC. Okay,
Mm.
so what does that mean? Well, for so many years, 100 years, when a song was played on the radio, the only people that got paid were the songwriters and publishers through ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. And yet, what was being played on the radio was the particular or not live, the particular recording of that song. Why weren't the artists and the record label being played? Because it was also being performed. It was just one of those particularities of the agreement and technology.
Mm.
Well, once technology changed and there was now digital streaming revenue, that was a new source of revenue. The record companies and artists all came in and said, we need to establish this collective to be able to collect on these revenues that we couldn't collect on before. So now you have record companies and featured artists, and then to a lesser degree, producers and co-collaborators and an artist who would be a co-featured or a featured. They split the revenue for the public performance of songs in the digital space.
Mm.
That was never available before. Now it doesn't. They should still get it in the terrestrial space, but that ship sailed. So at least they're getting it now in the digital space. So Sound Exchange, as I said, it's not nearly as lucrative as it used to be, because it used to collect a lot more revenues that now go through record labels and third parties. But it's in other countries that was always called neighboring rights.
Mm.
And most people in America had no clue what neighboring rights were. But neighboring rights are the performance rights that accompany the actual master recording. And that's important too for anybody in your audience who doesn't understand. There are two copyrights, right? There's the copyright in the underlying composition. So if I wrote Happy Birthday, you could record Happy Birthday, I could record Happy Birthday, and the guy down the street could record Happy Birthday, but only one person gets the money for the song, and that's the person who wrote and or owns the publishing.
Mm.
But then your recording of Happy Birthday is a separate copyright. That's called the master recording copyright. My recording of Happy Birthday, I'd have a copyright in that master recording copyright. So there's always these two copyrights, but the one who gets the lion's share, because no matter how many times you record it, there's only one person that's getting the publishing copyright. And then the hundreds of other people who record their own versions, each one of those gets the copyright for the version that they create. Well, it's that second copyright that is being accounted for in the performance now of an organization like Sound Exchange.
Mm.
Now let me jump to CCLI, because in the church music space, that was basically it was the parallel. It was the CSAC, the BMI, the ASCAP for the church space, because for many years, as worship music began to grow, you had worship songs being played in churches all across America and around the world, and no revenue was being collected for it. And at first there was resistance from churches thinking, well, is this the gospel, or are you trying to make a living? But it's the same as anything else. Does that mean that as Christians, we have to, as plumbers, we come in and do plumbing work, we have to do it all for free? Or as a lawyer, I have to do it all for free, right? There was an interesting psychology in transforming the church to understand, no, you have to pay for what has been created that you're using.
Mm.
I think we're beyond that now. I think most of that concern has disappeared. People understand that, no, these are creative contributors, and this is what they do for a living. So if you want to use their music to benefit your worship, you pay for that, like you pay for the guy who makes the roof over the sanctuary, or
Yeah.
like the guy who comes and does the plumbing. So CCLI was really important in opening up a stream of revenue for songs that were being played all over the world, but never would have been, not never, rarely would have been played on radio enough to amount to what my father used to call a hill of beans, right? Just not enough money over there. Because the market is the church. The market for most of the people who are writing these songs is the church. So CCLI has a number of different contracts, but basically there's two pools of revenue. There's CCLI that you sign up as a church so that you're paying for your use of other people's songs.
Mm.
And then there's CCLI where you are signing up all of your new songs so that if any other church plays your songs, you're getting money collected on your behalf and distributed to you. So I should note that both with ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, and with CCLI, you need to register if you are an independent creator as both a songwriter and as a publisher, because in all of these organizations, okay, so now we're going to get to a different, a more complex degree, right? I already said there's two copyrights. There's the underlying composition, and then there's the master recording. But even within the underlying composition, there's also two shares. There's what's called the publisher's share and the songwriter's share. Now, these shares aren't. It's still an intangible, right? We're still carving out a legal fiction in order to describe revenue streams. But the writer's share historically is 50% of the revenue, and the publisher's share is the other 50%. Well, it's always collected into shares, even though it's $1 of revenue. It's thought of by the collectors of the revenue. Well, here's the writer's share and the publisher's share. Well, if you're independent, you get all of that, but you still have to register it as a writer and a publisher. So a lot of new artists that I encounter, Wisdom, they've signed up with CCLI or with ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC as writers, but not as publishers, and yet they're independent and no one's collecting their publisher share. So they have to come up with a DBA or a company name and also affiliate as a publisher, at least for so long as they're independent.
Yeah.
Then if they sign with somebody, then that publishing revenue typically goes through, at least it's administered by the company that they sign with, and then it's split out. But hopefully that's not complex. We can get really deep really quickly.
No, that's great, because actually I think it was 2 days ago I spoke with an independent artist who has been registered with BMI, but just recently realized that they never registered as a publisher. Now they're having to go back and do that for over 100 songs that they've registered. So yeah, it's definitely very insightful. And can you tell us a little bit about the MLC?
I'm just so here's one area where I don't feel I'm equipped enough to. I don't want to mislead anybody. It's so new, and if we're talking humility, I'm not qualified enough to speak into that yet, because it hasn't really been a big enough area of my practice where it's been relevant yet.
Yeah.
It's new, and the amount of revenues being collected, it just hasn't become relevant unless you have a specific question about it.
Yeah. I guess one thing, tell me if you agree with this, but every artist, writer should register with the MLC to be able to collect mechanical royalties.
Yes, and I'm going to look as we're talking here for the date when that went into effect.
Yeah, I know it was pretty recent, a couple of years ago.
It's funny because it was the hot topic for so long at all the seminars. Whoops.
Yeah.
And I kind of, like I always do when those things come up, it's kind of what happened 30 years ago when the internet was 35 years ago, really. But right about the time I was coming here, all the talk, I remember just sitting back saying, I'm going to wait till this kind of works itself out to become relevant. And it did. It took a while to work itself out.
Yeah.
But to your point, by the way, anybody who doesn't know what we're talking about, MLC comes from the term means the Mechanical Licensing Collective, right? It's collective. Yeah. But if you go to the website, that's the biggest way to get the education, because it's about it's a bunch of royalty distribution revenues that weren't collected for the longest time, now collective because of an act of Congress. I forget the title, but we talked about that for years in seminar, and it never passed. And I think it was 22, maybe 21, somewhere around there. It passed. And yes, definitely register for it. But like a lot of these things, it's build it and they will come. So it's good to get registered and get into this process, but it's usually the cream of the crop that are getting paid the bulk, the lion's share of these royalties. And as I say, I need to be transparent and honest. It hasn't affected my practice yet.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it won't, but it's bubbling under so small and it's so new, and I usually let it. It hasn't affected any of my clients' revenues in any significant matter yet. So I kind of just take these things as they come. But as you say, Wisdom, it would be good advice for anybody new. You can't hurt, right? You sign up and you may say, well, I've never gotten paid anything. Well, I've had clients who used to be BMI members and they'd get a royalty check for 25 cents that wouldn't be released because they only pay it if it's $25 or more.
Yeah.
But that's all right because there's a time when you have success that all of a sudden the money will start rolling in. And
Yeah.
if you're not there, most of these organizations will only go back retroactively for a few accounting periods. So you'll
Mhm.
miss revenue that even was yours. So that's
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, and most of these organizations, just so everybody's aware, are nonprofits. Not all of them, but most of them, like the MLC, they're a nonprofit organization. And also, if this all sounds too overwhelming for you, you can register with an administrator, like a publishing administrator, and they can actually help you register for all of this.
And
So,
that's a good point you made too, because that's the only time where if you are a independent artist and you're having success and you say why should I affiliate or sign any kind of an agreement, if you can sign an admin, what we call in short term admin agreement, administration agreement with a reputable publisher, where you're not needing to give over your copyright interest, but you do pay a fee to
mhm,
the administrator to collect. The administrator takes care of all of this stuff, and
yeah,
they have people sitting at desks for this very reason to
yeah,
upload and get everything into the system, make sure you're collecting, and that's where it becomes really important. It's a big relief of a burden, not only from doing it, but you can trust that, oh, it's being taken care of, it's being watched out for. So if
yeah.
it's there to collect, they're going to collect it for me.
Yeah, I am very thankful for those people that will sit there and do
Me
all of that.
too.
It's kinda like coders, they just sit and code all day. I'm like, "Man, bless you," 'cause I couldn't
Yes,
do that.
I am right there with you. I am not a tech guy.
So Kevin, you mentioned copyrights a few times. Um, in this day and age, what does copywriting look like? Because I remember, because I released some stuff long, long time ago, late 90s, early 2000s. And, the poor man's like copyright is mail something to yourself, which I know isn't good advice. But what is the,
It's actually, go ahead, finish it. It's actually not bad advice, but go
oh,
ahead.
okay. Yeah, what should people be doing as far as like protecting their copyright?
Okay, so let me say to you first of all that the poor man's copyright is still an option, and it's not a
Mm,
bad option because your rights as a copyright holder exist from the time you create something original and then you fix it in a what's called a tangible meaning, a tangible form of expression.
mm,
So as long as you have those two elements, then it's yours, and it exists from the time of creation and putting it in that tangible means of expression. You have to prove it though.
mm,
So that's why the poor man's copyright of mailing something to yourself and not opening it is relevant because you get that postmark on there and you can put it in your box, and that's a perfectly valid form of proof.
mm,
The copyright registration process is primarily of benefit for purposes of notice. You're giving general notice to people that you own that copyright. It helps also if you're going to transfer your copyrights, you have a catalog listing. It's independently listed and governed under the copyright statutes. But the third and most significant reason to register a copyright usually happens before there's a lawsuit or litigation. I've had clients, multiple clients, who didn't register the copyrights because it was just too much of an administrative burden. But before they filed a lawsuit, they went ahead and registered those. And you may register them in April of 2024, but if you created them in 1985, you register them as of the date of creation, right? You're
mm,
filing your paper now. And as long as you get them registered before you file your lawsuit, you get the benefits of what's called treble damages, triple damages. If you win the case and you get statutory damages, then they can be tripled under certain circumstances. That's where the copyright registration benefits you.
mm.
But I, it's interesting because I've talked to record company executives in our industry, and they are, I would say, more than half of them don't even bother with registration of the copyrights with the Copyright Office until it becomes relevant to we're doing a sale of assets, so we have to do it, or we are getting ready for litigation because your right exists from the moment you create it. And the poor man's copyright, helpful, but even today, because of digital technology, you get timestamp codes. You can tell when you create it. It's forever connected to your music. and you have that right. So, and I'll tell you a funny story with it too. When I represented Tooth and Nail Records early on, and this would have been mid 1990s, I was helping one of their administrative assistants file all of their copyright registrations with the Copyright Office, both for their publishing catalog and for all the recorded product they had at that time. And I'll never forget the problem, and it's kind of I think it probably came out in the MLC conversation. As a lawyer, what I don't like is administrative work. I don't like that. I'm like, oh, please do that for me. I can give you the legal overview, but as far as the mechanics of it, please have someone else do it. And I think it goes back to this. It must have been 30 years ago, 94, 95, somewhere in there. I was doing this with Tooth and Nail, helping them. And the copyright applications at that time, they were all in hard copy form only. So we had to fill out these applications in ink, sign them, submit them to the Copyright Office in hard envelopes, with copies of the records that had been made. So it was a major project.
Yeah.
We got all of them back from the Copyright Office a couple months later saying they had all been filed incorrectly.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my gosh, what do we do? But the problem was, because I'm a lawyer, a lawyer knows too much about the copyright statute. And when you read those applications, it was kind of vague to me. I'm like, well, do they mean this or do they mean that? Whereas a person who wouldn't have learned or been informed as much about the copyright law and the details. So I overthought it. That was what happened. I overthought the process. And so instead of putting a check mark here, I said, no, put a check mark there. And so the woman that I was instructing to do that, she took my advice and she filled out every copyright box the way I said to, and we got them all back. And that's when I said, you know what? I know too much about this. Hire somebody who knows less than I do, so you're filing your forms correctly.
Wow. That's wild. I think I did that for one or two projects back in the day, and I felt overwhelmed by that.
Yeah. So I don't like it. It's amazing too. And you talk about different roles and the importance of different people in the industry. I have relied, especially since having made that early mistake, I've relied on people who have no desire to be knowledgeable about the law and they don't work in that space, but are excellent in preparing white sheets and all of the administrative work of, affiliating with the PROs, affiliating with MLC, affiliating with CCLI, Sound Exchange. I do work that involves all of those organizations, but I do it at the contract level and at the revenue stage and making sure, and then we get the accountants involved and we audit. But as to filling out those forms, I'm like, oh, it almost gives me PTSD.
Yeah. I have two more kind of legal questions, if you don't mind. One is, let's say there's artists right now listening that are being offered a deal from a Christian record label, or they're in talks. What is like a standard offer nowadays for an exclusive artist, where what's the standard percentage that they should expect to give up on the royalty side, and what's the typical structure of that?
Okay, so this a history lesson is also probably important here too, because this has changed. When I first got into the Christian music industry, unless you were a developed, experienced, maybe an artist on a second contract, or an artist who has sold enough records and had enough of a following to justify it, most Christian record deals, as I said earlier, the label and its affiliated publisher acquired both your recording contract rights and your publishing. And it was always 100% of the publishing, meaning the writer didn't own any copyright, but got his writer's share, her writer's share only. The administration was exclusively controlled by the publishing affiliate owned by the record company. And there were some, even back in the day, where all of that money was what we call cross-collateralized, where the publishing money and the record company money was all put into one pool so that the company could do everything to do to justify their expenditures on behalf of breaking the artist. And once you broke the artist, then you start to give more favorable provisions to the artist, and it balances out the equation. Well, I would say that the biggest change over the last 20 years, maybe 10 or 15, is that we finally gotten to a place in the Christian music industry where at least the publishing agreements, although they're still being offered by the labels, the publishing agreements are co-pub always, which means the artist is getting a share, usually 50%. On average, there's always exceptions. 50% of the publishing. Now the money's actually kind of less than it used to be. There used to be bigger advances because you're transferring all of your publishing to the label's affiliate publisher. And today, it depends on the publisher and depends on the artist's stature, and it also really depends if there's a competition for the
Mm,
artist. If there's only one label who's interested in you, then you don't really have a lot of bargaining power. The label says, we're interested and we want to invest this much, but this is all we can afford to invest. But if there's a competition and 2 or 3 other labels also are fighting for that artist, then like anything in life, right? The level of the deals come up because they're all fighting to say, no, we want to make sure that we sign this artist. We think this artist has a great career. So I have to remove those from the equation because those can go anywhere and
yeah.
those make all the standard provisions completely change.
Mm,
But if you are an artist that you're being offered a record deal and a publishing deal from a Christian record company, and there's no competition, and this is a new artist deal, sometimes it'll be 100%. Pretty much you should expect a co-pub deal now, but it's controlled by the company. The company will have exclusive administration rights. They might pay you in advance of $5,000 to $7,500 to sign on the publishing side. You might get a $2,500 artist advance, but the record company will pay for all of your recording costs. That's still baked in the deals. The record budgets are much smaller than they used to be. I mean, there was a time 20 years ago when Christian market record budgets for your top artists were $250,000.
wow.
Well, your top artists today are about 10% of that, right?
Mm,
You might have $25,000 or $50,000 for a top artist, and a new artist, you're looking at between $3,000 and $6,000 per song, maybe, if you have a really good producer that is going to command more of that. But producers have taken a hit. Producers work for much less than they used to, which is they have to produce many more sides than they used to. Instead of
mm,
getting paid $25,000 per song, now they're only getting paid $2,500 to $5,000 per song.
mm,
So, but that's the economics of it. We can't. Streaming is successful for the long term, and streaming is successful for the big artists. But at the front end, it's all investment by the label. So yeah, so you're talking about maybe collectively between the publishing deal and the artist deal, $10,000 to $15,000 is probably a fair deal.
mm,
You'll find some that'll go above that and some below it. And then, as I say, if you have a competitive deal, then it improves greatly. As far as royalty rates, we used to always calculate royalty rates on a retail basis because that's how it started in the general market, and the Christian market was formed after the general market. So the Christian market adopted general market principles. And then the general market switched to wholesale basis, which basically doubled all the royalties. So instead of a new artist getting between 7 and 10% of retail, they went to getting 14, 15 to 20% of wholesale. It doesn't change the dollar amount. It just means that you're basing it off of a smaller amount. Instead of basing it off of a $10 to $20 retail, you're basing it off of a $4 to $6 wholesale price.
mm,
And what the artists need to remember is that money almost never goes into your pocket until you're successful anyway, because it all goes to what we call the recoupment line. And this wisdom is probably the biggest difference I have with most other lawyers in our business. I represented so many record companies for so many years, and I understood how much the costs really were. When a new artist comes to me, I say, don't worry about making money from your record contract, right?
mm,
Get in advance to justify your contributions and signing and kind of getting into it. Get a publishing advance so that the publishing company is taking risk in buying your songs and doing this, right? And then use that money to help kind of build what you're gonna build as a new artist. But from that point on, you should use the deal and the arrangement with the record company as a platform and a tool. You should say, wow, now I've got another party who's interested in doing all the things that I don't have to do, exploiting my music, doing all the technical stuff, and putting me into the systems so that I can focus on being creative and then touring.
Mm,
Because touring, even though companies have tried to get into 360 models, it's kind of hard to do that. Some companies are still doing that,
mm,
but a 360 model is where the record company shares all of your revenue, not just your record revenue and your publishing revenue. But they did that when technology changed because all the revenue streams disappeared or greatly diminished. But for the most part, we've pushed back as an artist community, push back against the labels and say, look, it's not really fair for you to take touring revenues because you're not contributing. If you're going to buy into them, okay. But if you're just saying as a part and parcel of what you're doing, the artist is working so hard to develop these touring revenues, it's going to support the sale of records and vice versa.
mm.
So I always tell a new artist, don't look to make money, especially from your first record deal. Okay, if you have success and you renegotiate, then you get a more improved deal, then you can look for that for money. But at the front end, look at it as a tool to get your music to as many people as possible so that you can now freely go and tour.
Mm.
Music is an advertisement. I mean, music really, especially in our industry, should be looked at as an advertisement for your live touring services. So much of our business has been motivated by and driven by touring, which is why, by the way, when everything was shut down in 2020, of course, all live touring stopped. But the Christian industry in particular took an incredibly hard hit because most of our revenues, as it relates, if you were to take a proportion, and I don't know what the exact proportion is, but in the Christian music industry, the proportion of revenue from touring versus publishing and recorded revenue is far greater in the Christian music industry, meaning we need to be touring in this space in order to make a living.
Yeah, man, that's really great perspective and advice. I actually always tell artists you have to look at your music as a promotional tool and don't
Amen.
expect to generate revenue from it.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's awesome. If you
If
have,
you do, and if you do, by the way, then that's like cream on top, right?
yeah,
That's a benefit because over time you'll develop a good publishing catalog. And as I said earlier, you can get to a point where you can sell your publishing catalog, then make a new one. That's really good. But as you say, if you look at it as a promotion opportunity, you'll first of all you won't be so discouraged and you won't have the tendency to look at your record label publisher as other than a partner. And a lot of
mm,
times the lawyers get in and create such an adversarial relationship. I mean, it
mm,
is by nature because it's this party and that party, but the record companies, when it starts, the record companies want to be your partner. They're investing because
yeah,
they believe in your music. So if you can take that approach, then you can set aside and say, okay, let them make their money on that, because if they make their money, then they're going to be selling more of my records. They'll be more motivated to do it, and I'm
yeah,
going to make it over here. There'll be a point in the future where that will converge and you'll both be able to make money from the sale of your records. But as you say, at the front end, look at it as an opportunity for free promotion at someone else's cost, because at least
yeah,
you don't have to go out of pocket for it.
yeah. My last question is for churches and worship pastors listening, because I come across this a lot. Is like, what is best practice approach for setting up publishing when you're a church and you have, staff and volunteers that are writing for church projects? How would you advise on that?
So it's really important discussion because, as you've kind of hinted, it, it's it's been handled interestingly in the past, and a lot of churches and creators, I think, have gotten into uncomfortable relationships because they didn't address it up front. Because you're right, in a church, the worship team, other than the worship leader, they're all volunteers, right? On a Sunday to Sunday basis, or if you do a special event or a Wednesday night service. And yet, in most of those churches, especially the bigger churches and the ones who are creating original music, they are still creative participants who are volunteers. So you want to find that sweet spot where you are not ignoring or disrespecting the creative participants, but also recognizing that, well, it's the church who's providing them this platform to do this music. So in my experience, there's a twofold approach. One, the church absolutely has to control the admin of all of that. This is the church's music. It's coming out of the church. If you're a member of this church, if you are a creative participant, the church controls it. But you as a songwriter, and this is typically how I do it, it's not exclusive. There are other options. We always make the distinction between the church owns the copyright in the master recording, and then the publishing, it's administered by the church, but then it's co-pub. So
Mm.
all the writers get first of all, they get all the writer's share of income, and then they share in the publishing revenue too, depending on the church, depending on the dynamics. And I've seen that range anywhere from a 50-50 co-pub to a 25-75 in favor of the church, 25-75 in favor of the contributor. But I think it's really important that anybody who's on a worship team who's truly contributing to a song be compensated as a songwriter, while acknowledging that they're volunteering and being part of that. And whether it's a writer's camp where they create the songs, or whether they do it at the church, maybe not in a writer's camp environment, but they're creating at the church. They've got to remember that this is for the church and it does belong to the church. But yes, they should get participants. So to that end, the practical is the church should prepare and deliver for the creators what we call single song agreements, which is the same as what would be an exclusive songwriter agreement that you would sign with a publisher affiliated with a label, except it's just for the specific songs that you write for the church. And then you add to them on a schedule. So if you co-wrote 3 or 4 songs over a year, the only thing that you're transferring to the church are those 3 or 4 songs that you wrote, and you will get paid for them, right? There'll be a share of revenue, but you're free to go sign an exclusive songwriter agreement with another publisher if you want, that doesn't involve these songs. So if you write a different style of music, or if you come to the point where you're like, okay, I'm now having enough success, somebody's going to pay me in advance to go sign an exclusive songwriter deal. That is really the kind of where the rubber meets the road, because when an artist or a creator gets big enough to sign an outside deal, then what they're creating for the church now becomes subject in part to that. And there has to be an understanding between the new publisher and the church as to how those rights are worked out going forward.
Yeah.
Does that cover enough, or did I
Yeah.
confuse you?
Yeah, that's great. I also see some churches nowadays that basically tell the, songwriters, we don't want to be a publisher. You guys be your own publisher and songwriter and handle your own admin and everything.
Yeah, and I've seen that get just like, I think, let me answer it this way. Yes, I've seen that, just like I've seen it when the church owns everything, which on the song,
Yeah.
which is also, I don't think, is a good thing. The reason either of those tend to break down is that somebody down the road becomes disillusioned and said, wait a second, we don't own any of that. The church
Mhm.
board says all of these songs, yes, we own the master copyright, but we don't own any of the publishing, and we've been paying for the rehearsal space, and we pay the electricity at the church, and they come here, and then the artist develops a career out of it, then goes signs a record deal, and the church is like, we don't own any of that.
Mm.
So it tends to break down, but it breaks down the other way too. When
Yeah.
you have a writer where the church has taken all of it, and then the writer says, wait a second, I've contributed this music. This is my living. I've
Mm.
contributed myself. So that's why I think the co-pub relationships on the song is most fruitful, and I think it's most fair to both organizations, even if one of them says at the front, "Oh, no, I don't need to own that," and they
Mm.
could absolutely be honest and sincere with it. But
Yeah.
then you get 2 or 3 years down the road, and then disillusionment sinks in, and then they get in a fight about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's also kind of biblical too, you're co-laboring with the church, and both like partnering
Yeah,
together in it.
amen. Love the biblical reference.
Yeah, and it's funny. I talk to a lot of churches and worship leaders that are like, "Yeah, our church doesn't care." And then I ask, "Do you guys have that in writing somewhere?" And they said, "No, they, just told me that they don't care about that." And I said, I always say, yeah, nobody cares when it's a zero
Yeah,
after the dollar sign. When there's a one and a multiple of zeros, then everybody cares.
Yes, and that's such a good point, Wisdom, because when there is no money, people look at you like, why would I want to have this document, which because there are terms of art in transferring copyright that need to be in the agreement. You can't say it, you can't make it up and say it in softer language. Sometimes people say, well, can you write that softer? And I say, well, I could, but it's not going to avail you any protection,
Mm,
because what I'm creating is nothing new. I'm creating a document based upon long established principles of copyright transfer, and there have to be certain magic words have to be there, otherwise you may as well not do any paper. But as you point out, when there's no money involved, people are like, these are my friends and these are my brothers and sisters in Christ, and I don't want to have paperwork. But then if it starts generating millions of dollars in revenue, suddenly
yeah,
it matters a lot. And then it makes all kind the tension that you feel when there's no money is exacerbated beyond the moon
yeah,
when there is money and there's no paperwork. Yeah,
yeah,
paper up front, despite the and I found I did this recently. I make myself available not only to the church, so if I'm representing a church and they're signing writers, I make myself available on a conference call or a meeting to say, writers, ask me any questions you want. Most
mm,
people have never seen these agreements before.
yeah,
I want to get you comfortable with it. I'm not representing the writers, but I'm teaching them, right? So they
yeah,
understand what they're signing.
mm,
That goes like 90%, a long way in kind of eliminating any confusion or mystery about, are they being asked to sign something unfair?
yeah, yeah, man. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your insights. It's been super valuable. And if you're listening to this, especially for churches, I've come across this a lot where they're like, yeah, we have a nonprofit attorney that's going to draft up these agreements. I always recommend like working with an entertainment lawyer that specializes in this field, which, I mean, thank you for just serving the Christian music community so faithfully for over 3 decades.
No, it's been an honor. It's been a privilege. I'm here as long as God wants me, and for some reason, I've never. Every time I think it's going to dry up, there's a bunch of new business comes in. I'm like, okay, I guess God wants me in this space. So
Yeah.
it's been it's been a real privilege and an honor to speak with you today, Wisdom.
Yeah, thank you so much. Is there a way that you want people to connect with you if they're interested?
Yeah, best way to reach me is by email. I'm kind of old fashioned that way, and it's just my first name, Kevin, Kevin, at my last name, which is Kookogey, spelled Kookogey.com. So that's Kevin at Kookogey.com. And I will add this too. If you send me a random email, just say I saw you on Wisdom's podcast or something like that,
Yeah.
so it doesn't go into spam. Or if it does, I'm like, okay, I can extract it. Otherwise, I'll be, who is this? I'm afraid to open it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the best way to get a hold of me. And typically, you'll hear an answer from me, even if I can't respond substantively. Substantively, I'll send an email within a day or two to say, got your email. I'll call you next week or something like that.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Kevin. I'm sure, I mean, I can picture people taking just so many notes from this podcast and
Yeah,
then sending it to their, pastor or whoever. So, yeah, I
thank
appreciate
you.
you.
Yep,
Yeah, thank you.
my pleasure. Thank you very much.